it's part of this process of completely destroying any sense of a welfare state of the kind that emerged, say, in the 40s, and that was progressively built on for not much more than about a decade and a half. I mean, it's a management of politics that has now seen its culmination in British politics in the last maybe 20 years or whatever. What Thatcher effected was a counter-revolution, okay, against the welfare state. And the welfare state was the one lesson that the ruling class drew from the crisis and from fascism, okay? The drive to contain class struggle and contain social tensions by managing security and managing employment and making sure that full employment was the key objective of the state. Now that whole doctrine was smashed and discarded in the 1980s with the deregulation of markets and the attack on public spending and the attack on welfare as a desirable objective, as something worth having and worth striving for. And what replaced those ideas was this extremely brutal kind of assertion of the market and of market relationships. And that is what progressively extends to, it's that logic which is extending to education, to health, and to a whole series of social sectors where it was crucial to have subvention from the state, because the state is essentially, in that sense, it's the rational state, it's the expression of a collective. But if the state itself is being privatized, as it has been in Britain to a large extent, so that public authority becomes this nebulous thing which is not, not completely within the social control of people. On the one hand, it's not quite like a private firm, but it's tending in the direction of a massive private firm. Both in India and elsewhere, I think what you need to do is to reconstruct a culture of political debate on the left. I mean, in the West, the problem is the lack of communication between different sectors of the left itself and its inability to communicate its political vision to a wider audience, okay? Which requires a kind of imagination that it doesn't seem to have at the moment. And in India, the essential task is to actually generate a culture of debating things, of debating politics, which we don't have. I mean, the left is fragmented, but beyond that, there's also this fear of debating and discussing issues politically in a public way. So that's part of the problem. And then secondly, you take theory seriously, which means you make it part of politics. You make discussions of capital and both the richness, the strength of capital, as well as its limits and so on. You make those discussions an organic part of your political evolution and your understanding. So it's not just something out there, but it has a bearing on your political practice. I mean, to take some obvious examples, like our understanding of trade unionism, okay? There's no point in kind of starting with an a priori notion of the unions as such and such and suffering from such and such limitations. But it's important to see what forms unionism takes today. Insofar as it's survived at all and hasn't been completely defeated, then what forms it's beginning to take. And to be able to relate to those forms and to the struggles that are connected with them, I mean, the idea of the working class as essentially the class that hegemonizes a revolutionary process is completely missing in a lot of politics that's dominated by parties which see themselves as somehow leading a revolution, leading the working class to a revolution, whereas in fact, of course, it's workers and their own kind of collective awareness and ability to deal with situations that will ultimately regenerate working class politics. All sections of the working class that create value for capital, all right, that are subsumed into the accumulation process and so on, are part of the working class, in that broad sense. And as a matter of fact, I think wage labor is the dominant relationship worldwide today, whether it's China or India or European capitalism or the US. The problem is not there. The problem lies in terms of the phenomenal levels of unemployment that have now been inflicted on the massive population in most advanced capitalist countries. high levels of unemployment always existed in countries like India anyway. But what you've seen in the West is a resurgence of unemployment in a sense which you never saw. So, I mean, the last time you saw it was the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then you had Keynesianism and attempts to kind of manage the economy and get employment back to levels of full employment and so on. But what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years is essentially a reversion to crisis levels of unemployment. That's something that the left hasn't paid sufficient attention to. In other words, how are the unemployed to be integrated into a working class movement? I mean, they don't have an identity that's based on any stable workplace. They don't necessarily form part of stable communities. So in what way do you address the issue of unemployment, and how do you kind of integrate the vast mass of the unemployed into your kind of political program, your vision of politics? I think something like 80 to 85% of the population in a country like India would be wage laborers in one form or another, which isn't to say that it's a homogeneous class. It's deeply fragmented and stratified by all kinds of things, by caste, by religion, by locality, by region, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, by gender. It's divided by gender as well. But potentially, that is the working class. I mean, 80 to 85% of a country labors for capital and under capital. Formalism dominated Marxist theory or styles of thinking, Marxist thinking, for decades together, especially in the kind of Stalinist period. What people in the political movement have to do is appropriate reality in the ways that Marx himself did when he confronted capitalism in the 19th century. In other words, you have to be able to reconstruct the reality of capital in the contexts and the forms in which it actually makes meaningful statements, and not simply apply ready-made categories to a reality which is constantly changing and necessarily fluid and complex. The most obvious political implication is that the connection between theory, as it comes down to us through the Marxist tradition, and politics is snapped, so that there's no kind of organic link anymore, and theory itself is degraded to the status of a set of formulas. It ceases to be either a guide to study or a tool for actually interpreting and understanding reality, the situation which you're located in. The more general political implication is that, theory doesn't matter, basically. A party program can be constructed as a set of formulas which ostensibly is about reality, but it actually has nothing to do with it. Look at the Maoist parties in India, the CPIM and so on. Their characterizations of Indian reality are so far removed from the reality of Indian capitalism that one can't see how they could possibly form the basis for any kind of politics. And they don't. Effectively, they don't form a basis for politics, because politics in this case simply means pursuing a particular strategy like the armed struggle, for which you don't need much guidance from theory, or alternatively simply striking up a series of opportunist alliances within the electoral system, as the CPI and the CPM have done, mainly the CPM, so that there's no unity of theory and practice in any kind of traditional left-wing sense left any longer, because theory has ceased to matter. I think fascism is a major political threat today, and that the left doesn't take it seriously enough. The latest issue of HM has a piece that I translated from Arthur Rosenberg's work on fascism. It's called Fascism as a Mass Movement. And what's important about Rosenberg's analysis is that it tries to locate the roots of fascism in a deeper sense than traditional views of fascism as simply a kind of some irrational outburst of the petty bourgeoisie. Okay, he's trying to show that fascism doesn't succeed except as a mass movement, and then suggests ways in which that mass mobilization is actually constructed. Now, for someone who basically lives in India, this is perfectly obvious, because from the 1980s onwards, we've had a very well organized and powerful right-wing movement, which has systematically used communalism, that's in the Indian sense of communalism, that's religious identities and sectarian divides and so on, to construct, to mobilize a mass base. It's had its ups and downs, but it's an extremely well organized right-wing movement. It's sort of patriotic, it's nationalist, and because the left hasn't thought sufficiently about nationalism and left-wing politics, and is largely kind of a votary of a kind of soft nationalism, right? A kind of soft economic nationalism and so on. It's not able to actually offer a basis for critiquing the nationalism of the right, because they share a lot of these assumptions. I'm talking about the left in India, the party left, the CPM and so on. But it's crucial to be able to understand what fascism is and how one begins to build an opposition to it at all sorts of different levels, including culture, which is where fascism scores in terms of its capacity to mobilize. It would vary from one context to another. I mean, in the West, it's mainly the issue of racism and the ability to show that that the crisis has nothing to do with immigration into the labor market and into the country and so on, and to be able to actually project alternatives to the existing forms that exist. Alternatives to capitalism, which I don't think are sort of forthcoming. In a country like India, decommunalizing Indian politics and Indian culture, which is a massive task because they're both so thoroughly communalized. The middle class in India is thoroughly communal. It sort of subscribes to this kind of Islamophobic prejudice fully, and it has done so now for several decades. So it's like a second nature to the middle class there, but it's our form of racism. So, communalism is our form of racism, but without centrally addressing those issues of the kind of stranglehold of both nationalist and communal ideas over very wide sections of the population, I don't think you can have a kind of successful anti-fascist movement. I think Britain's heading for a massive crisis. I don't mean that simply in an economic sense. I mean there is a complete political breakdown in the ruling class. They have no ideas for the future of British capitalism. None whatsoever. They've pinned their hopes on the continued dominance of the city. All right? That's the one coherent source of their kind of vision, political vision. And it's the city which has seen a battering in the recent financial collapse. Okay? In any case, there are no kind of large UK banks left. They were all taken over by the Americans in the 1990s. Okay? So there was a kind of wholesale Americanization of banking in this country. And then you had the crisis of 2007-8 with the legacy that it has left, namely in terms of austerity politics. And then now you've got this recent scam, which further undermines the credibility of London as a financial center that can retain its dominance. Okay. Now imagine in that context, if you have Scotland declaring independence, supposing, okay, that's going to be a further blow to the stability and the future of British capitalism. So I think the left in this country in particular has to be able to come up with a whole series of alternatives that strike people as plausible, as credible, as things that are within their reach. The left has to be able to invent that language of politics and a language in which it can critique the state. It's not enough to say this is all neoliberalism. Because that doesn't get through to people. It's just a cliche. It's crucial to be able to construct alternatives to what is happening today. And what is happening today is a very brutal assertion of the market in the sense of the abdication of the idea of a state.